We are going live this morning very early because it is now 9:30 p.m. In Manila, which is where Glenda Gloria is residing. So we wanted to make sure that we could have her insights on today's discussion because it's so important. And as Jonathan Ong was just telling me, there's been some interesting breaking news that we're gonna discuss today. Today, we're talking specifically about fighting a two-front war, censorship and disinformation in Southeast Asia. I am not a topical expert on this area. I know a little bit about disinformation though, but I'm really going to be relying on today's guests and panelists to drive the conversation, to give us really deep insights about what's happening on the ground, and hopefully we will come to discussing how others can help with the efforts to handle some of the egregious censorship that's going on, especially through digital infrastructures and in the press, while also raising up the voices of journalists who rely on the internet to be able to speak out and boldly. And so we are just so excited to talk about what's happening right now. Our guests today are, as I've mentioned, Glenda Gloria, who is the managing editor of Rappler and one of its co-founders. And she has worked extensively in news in the Philippines for quite some time now. And she's written 2 groundbreaking books, Under the Crescent Moon, Rebellion in Mindanao. I probably said that wrong, but I'm trying. And The Enemy Within, an inside story on military corruption. We also have Associate Professor of Global Digital Media in the Department of Communication at UMass Amherst, Jonathan Corpus Ong. Very jealous that you get to work out at UMass Amherst. It's beautiful out there and a really good place to study. He's the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Television and New Media, which I highly suggest people check out. And his expertise is on the social and moral consequences of media in the everyday lives of vulnerable communities, particularly in the global South. In the link that you see in the chat, you will notice that there's some links over there, but within the Medium link, you can find links to Jonathan's new reports, as well as other research that he has published. And last but not least, near and dear to my heart, Gabby Lim, who's a researcher on the Technology and Social Change Project with me at Harvard Kennedy's Shorenstein Center. And she's also a fellow at Citizen Lab, an associate at, or an affiliate at Data and Society. And she recently published an amazing report on the securitization of fake news with Data and Society, which is also linked in her bio. I'm Joan Donovan, who is the research director of the Shorenstein Center currently, and really a big pleasure. Welcome everyone to the chat and welcome our panelists. Thank you for doing this either so early or so late, depending on where you are. So I wanted to open up conversation by saying, you know, what happened today? I know that there was a really important a ruling has come down around broadcast news, and I want to hear from your perspectives. If someone wants to jump in and maybe just describe in very broad detail what the event was, and then we can start to get into the intricacies of how this affects your research, as well as the capacity for journalists to do their jobs in the Philippines. Jonathan, do you want to start, or Glenda, either?
I think Glenda should start, given that she's closer to the action.
Well,
Thank
good
you.
evening from Manila. It's not a very good evening here. Today, a congressional panel just decided to kill the franchise of ABS-CBN, which is the country's biggest network and which has been operating since the post-Marcos years and even prior to that. What that says is and indicates is that this is another serious blow against independent media and against Philippine media in general. The latest of the series of attacks that have been mounted against Philippine journalism since Duterte came to power in 2016.
ABS-CBN has a very long history. Of course, it is an attack on press freedom. They employ a lot of creative workers. Is it 11,000 employees that have
Yes.
lost their job in the middle of a pandemic? They're also well known, not just for, of course, news, but also for entertainment. They even have a very well-known charity and foundation that is actually quite important when it comes to disaster relief. One of my earlier studies was actually focused on that, about how unique the Philippine TV story is in terms of how media institutions are not just there to provide news and entertainment, but to intervene in kind of social services to fill the gaps of a weak state. And so, yeah, I'm very much in solidarity with many of my colleagues there.
And I should say that, you know, one of the things that we've been struggling with studying disinformation, especially medical misinformation in this moment, is the role that local news, when it's missing, you're right to say that there is a social service component to having news available, especially in moments of big disasters, because that's where people are going to turn to in order to get information. And so that they're not just there to broadcast out, but they also take in information, sort it, and distill it so that people have a similar picture to talk to one another about. Now, Gabby, I wanted to ask then, in terms of the kinds of research that you were doing when you were with Data and Society, how much of this plays into the policies that you were studying? Do you see this as something that maybe you were able to forecast or see as a evolution of these laws that are are about combating fake news ostensibly, but also have serious repercussions for journalism?
I wouldn't say that I predicted anything. I can't forecast very much. But I think whenever we see not just disinformation, but all types of what we can say problematic content, whether that's hate speech, terrorist recruiting content, critical content, there's always a predilection of authoritarian governments to seize upon problematic information and frame it as either a threat to national security, threat to public order, threat to national harmony. You know, there's a bunch of different verbiage they use. So yes, I would say when the idea that fake news and disinformation started being associated with national security issues, I think a lot of scholars in this field started to perk up and think, whenever something is linked to national security or public order, that could be a recipe for disaster. So I think it was only a matter of time. And now we've seen in multiple countries, not just Malaysia, but Singapore, I think even China and Russia and Egypt have put out their variations of legislation that's on the surface aimed to target disinformation, fake news. Every country has a different term for it. But yeah, I think it's something we've all been watching with pretty close eye and thinking, yikes, what is this going to look like and how is it actually going to be enforced? Will platforms actually comply with the legislation? Will they ignore it? So I think about Canada, it's a small market. When Canada made demands of the platforms, a couple of them just said, we're just going to pull out of the entire market because Canada is such a small country, so we're not even going to comply. But as we've seen in Singapore, Facebook has complied with their labeling laws and certain content takedown. So I think it's still to be determined how enforcement's actually going to look like. But when governments can't get platforms to comply, they then do the other thing, which is arrest people or seize devices or, not issue franchises or licensing, which has often been the case in the past. So I think how governments control the information space is often shifting. They don't have just one tactic, they have a whole kit.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that, the kit, or the way in which suppression can happen as, in a way, you know, under the cover of this notion of a public good or national security. Specifically, I'm really interested to hear from you, Glinda, an update about what's going on with Rappler. For folks that don't know, there was a recent conviction of the Rappler's chief CEO and executive editor, Maria Ressa, as well as the former Rappler research writer, Reynaldo Santos, over libel charges. And many of us, as well as journalists and human rights defenders, are thinking really deeply about how this verdict is going to really chill the way in which journalists are able to operate. Others have referred to this verdict as a tragedy for Philippine democracy. Would you be able to walk us through the trial and speak to some of the repercussions that it's had on your newsroom?
Well, thank you for that. The cyber libel conviction of Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos happened barely a month ago. It is just one of the 8 active court cases that Rappler, Maria, and the board of directors, including myself, are facing. And this has resulted in a lot of psychological setbacks organizationally, but on the other hand, has also strengthened the team, which is composed largely of very young, idealistic journalists. But I think we've always said this time and again, that the problem that Rappler and Maria face, the 8 active court cases and the sustained attacks against it, is not about Rappler. It really is reflective of the kind of media environment that we are facing under this regime. Because before Rappler was the Philippine Daily Inquirer, which was also the biggest newspaper in the country, whose owners were also pressured by the Duterte administration to back down and to sell the newspaper to a businessman friendly to the administration. But that sale has not been consummated, and therefore the owners of the Inquirer are left hanging in the back. The third media company that was attacked by this government is precisely ABS-CBN, whose franchise was officially killed just today. The impact of that has been both ways. Internally, Rappler has been emboldened by and actually just had to courage on to not only fight these attacks, but to show that as a journalism-led organization with no vested interests other than journalism, we have to survive this regime. And happily, we are able to do that. And we ended the year actually with a net income, happily, after 8 years in existence. And why has Rappler been able to do that? I guess partly also of the kind of support globally, the kind of telling the story of the Philippines through Rappler that has happened outside the Philippines. And yes, it's been very tough, but on the other hand, as we always say, crisis is an opportunity, and it has really allowed us also to collaborate with other journalists abroad. It has allowed us to push for really institutional reforms as far as Facebook is concerned, because connected to our problem now and rooted, the deep root of that is precisely the kind of disinformation campaign that started in 2016 against Philippine media that has really spread 3 consistent lies against Philippine media, that the journalists are prostitutes, from the word prostitute and the press, and that the Philippine media is biased. That spread of lies, consistent, sustained, and state-backed, were spread on social media, and we are where we are right now because of that. But Jonathan could probably just add more to that.
Yeah, Jonathan, I did want to follow up with you to talk a bit about, you know, we're facing a twin problem that Glenda has really pointed out, which is that the way that networked communication and the internet has allowed us to reach out across vast distances and work on collaborations that may have never come about without the internet has put us into a situation where we have a twin problem, though, of exactly what you study, which is disinformation, people pretending to be journalists, pretending to be influencers, governments masquerading as crowds or citizens that are fighting these digital battles. Could you walk us through a bit about what you've seen in your research and how this twin problem develops, and what are the implications for the internet when you have a real need for, fighting back against disinformation, but at the same time, we have to protect the notion of open communication so that we can continue on to have these really important collaborations and global communities develop?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Joan. And I agree with Glenda that we need to combine an understanding of the digital environment and how it works, the different players and bad actors in it, with also a critique of political leadership. And in a way, we need to kind of begin with that, really, to assign central responsibility to the current administration and to Duterte. So yeah, just to take you through this, for those of you who are less familiar, so Duterte's leadership and his popularity, it's not all manipulated, right? It's not all just top down, that it's people have been brainwashed by him. So there's real electoral insurgency that is spontaneous around his election, in a way that he's able to legitimize, to affirm people's grievances around leaders, elite institutions that have perhaps silenced or delegitimized poor people's grievances and anxiety. So the scholar Nicole Corato talks about the latent anxieties of the public that have been affirmed by Duterte's leadership. So his style of leadership is that of an authoritarian trickster, and I use the term that Vince Raphael uses. So he's an authoritarian on one hand. He doesn't like being criticized. He doesn't really engage with his critics. He's not going to participate in reasoned dialogue, but in a kind of trickster fashion. So how he silences his critics is to reduce them to caricatures. And use sometimes humor, sometimes crass language, gutter language, and has really normalized that. And that combined and fanned in digital environments where this kind of gutter language has become normalized, even encouraged, and even perhaps become profitable, that will have lasting pernicious effects in democratic practice and deliberation. So we're unable now to engage in reasoned debate or scientific evidence, and yeah, sometimes like the criticisms around the government response to COVID, right? Yeah, are based on like gaslighting, like fudged statistics. And so there's always a sense of we're not entirely sure like how to engage with political criticism of this administration. If his opponents are caricatured, and in this case with Rappler and ABS-CBN, silenced and attacked and harassed. Journalists are in the front line. Human rights activists are also in that front line. And my own recent research identifies the different survival strategies of those people on the front line. So some, like Rappler, have really held their line and stood there. Others are trying more back channel kind of strategies to find different ways to avoid being in that firing line, because you would not want to be in that position.
Very interesting. Gabby, I wanted to ask you a bit more, since we fight about definitions so often. Pop quiz, right? When you're thinking about authoritarianism, are there characteristics that people should be looking out for, things that people should be thinking of when they're starting to try to figure out, well, what is the difference between censorship and the need for, say, content moderation, or, you know, and especially as we think about your research around how cyber troops are deployed on social media. Sometimes, of course, they are bots, other times they're real people. You know, and as in your study in Malaysia, think about information operations. How do we try to link up the technologies of the internet with authoritarianism as you see it?
Big question, Joan.
It's a galaxy brain question. I'm sorry, but that's what happens to me in the morning. That's what you get. You get me after 3 p.m. a little sleepy, but
yeah.
That's what you're getting this morning.
I think something to keep in mind is that, you know, I think often people in the West have this idea that authoritarian regimes are this hyper centralized, top-down control, and that's rarely the case. I think more we see is they're hybrids, they're hybrid regimes, so they can be ostensibly a democracy, like Malaysia is a democracy, you elect your leaders. However, all the means to enable a fair and free democracy aren't always there. So gerrymandering is a huge issue in Malaysia. Outright control and ownership of mainstream press is an issue. Links between ISPs and telcos with the government is an issue. Who they allow to speak and who they don't allow to speak. So for example, certain universities in Malaysia have pretty strict rules about written rules and unwritten rules about who can you bring into the university. So there were some universities who, it was straight up, they would say, you cannot invite anyone from the opposition to this university, not even to speak. And so there are all these different layers and mechanisms that they can maintain control while still saying they're a democracy. So that's one thing. The second part of your question, what was it again?
There's more about how that links into the notion of censorship around when we get into a situation where we've got cyber troops. You know, some might argue that is fair play in terms of the internet, because you sign up with an account, nobody's required to give their, you know, home address and real names. You know, you're supposed to, but you don't have to, right? So, you know, how does the cyber trooper phenomenon fit into this either NatSec approach that we're thinking about, national security, or is this you know, more about just the design of the internet in and of itself? Because I'm very concerned about these tactics have been around a long time and they're not going away. And
for sure.
If they are aiding authoritarian governments, you know, how do we conceptualize that?
So the term cyber troopers in Malaysia is a very old term. Like I've seen, I think, blog posts referring to the term cyber trooper as early as like 2009, 2010. So it's not a new phenomenon. And it's a pretty loose term. You can use it in almost any context. Someone who replies to a post in the comment section you don't like. It could be state-backed, it could be funded, or it could be often by volunteers of the political party. And so because it's been around for so long, at least in the context of Malaysia, I think there's a level of normalization around it. Like if you see 50 comments under a tweet or blog post, that's just a copy pasta again and again and again. People are like, oh, cyber troopers, and kind of dismiss it. From interviewing civil society in Malaysia, I think the more pressing concern for them is not the online cyber troopers, though they are an issue because they often engage in targeted harassment, and that has pretty bad effects on self-censorship, especially when it's targeting women journalists. But for them, I think the big issue is not so much the cyber troopers, but mainstream media and the control of mainstream media over broadcast radio and print. And that has traditionally been controlled or directly influenced by a single coalition. And I think for a long time, opposition parties and dissidents had, for a short time, the advantage on Facebook and Twitter. That's already shifting, and I think we can tell in the Philippines it's definitely shifted. yeah, I think the concern is not just the cyber troopers online, but it's the whole ecosystem, and the mainstream press is very, very much the concern.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, I think you probably have something to say about this as well, in terms of how are groups on the ground responding to tactics being used by authoritarian governments or coalitions that might even be driven by dark money, that are efforts to suppress press freedoms, but also efforts to suppress civil society groups that are interested in free and open communication.
Yeah, before I get into the resistance part, I'll just add to what Gabby said on the other kinds of authoritarian tactics, like what else is part of their playbook. I think Thailand actually has many interesting examples. In a way, they're kind of further ahead of this depolarization that other Southeast Asian countries are in the process of getting into. So the hardening of political lines, right? In Thailand, there's a much longer history of political polarization, and with a military aligned party that's currently in power. In the last election, one of the new quote unquote innovations that they've introduced is how the election commission would arbitrarily apply their rules to target opposition parties. So some opposition parties or candidates get disqualified in the middle of the race. And even at the after the election, certain seats in the parliament were rearranged and realigned to favor the military-aligned party. So I wonder whether that's something that other Southeast Asian countries should worry about as well, how election commission rules might become partisan down the road. Just to think about how these kind of arbitrary application of rules would have snowball effects across the region. In terms of resistance, what I observe about human rights actors in the Philippines in particular, this a way in which they mitigate being in the firing line is by immersing in local communities. And for me, that comes at a cost. It's both a strength, but there's a weakness to this strategy. So human rights actors, which are frontlining against the government, such as the Commission on Human Rights, they've been threatened to be defunded, right? Like that's a conversation in the Philippines, not like military defunding, but like Human Rights Commission defunding. They were threatened by Duterte of being defunded. At some point, like their funding was reinstated, which is good, but other human rights organizations don't want to be in that position. So their strategy was, okay, let's just go grassroots, low publicity kinds of local interventions. And for me, the cost of this is they kind of allow the government, but also disinformation agents to control the public narrative around the human rights space. And some of the disinformation narratives around them is that they're conspiratorially aligned with foreign funders, or even with politicians or with journalists. And as a way to, so the strategies of human rights actors to not engage with that, that means that narrative might just spread, might just amplify, people might believe in that. And that's one of the recommendations of our report, that people need to find ways to address and engage with this conversation, and not just completely withdraw, although it might be understandable that people don't want to be in the front lines.
Yeah, the foreign collusion thing is pretty common. Sorry, Joan.
No, I was going to say that is something that we hear pretty often, even in the United States, this idea that there's sort of shadowy figures behind any and every kind of uprising. And I think also the way in which crowdsourcing has really made it possible for certain groups and press to stay afloat has been really an important innovation in our economies of speech. But at the same time, it comes at the cost of not being really reliable, and also leading to these conspiratorial narratives that there is something deeper behind what's going on. Glenda, I wanted to ask you specifically around the way in which Rappler has engaged with and tried to resist some of this suppression. I've talked with Maria in depth about the kinds of harassment that she's endured as a female journalist, the kinds of doxing and imagery and all of the things that anybody can imagine that could happen to someone by virtue of being a public figure, how that can often shape us as people, make it for some of us more challenging to speak out in public. And in some cases, as you've already said, emboldens folks. But over the past couple of weeks, I'm sure things have gotten much more difficult for Rappler, especially in the online environment. And one of my, I think one of the most interesting things that people could also learn about this is if you could tell us a bit about the narrative arc of how Rappler came to be, what, because it was deeply embedded in social media in the beginning, and Facebook was an integral part of the infrastructure. But that open structure, the comment sections, these things then became battlegrounds with, very loose definition of cyber troopers attacking you daily. But if you want to describe a bit of that arc of the story of the last few years of Rappler for those who don't know.
Well, yes, certainly. Thank you for that. When Rappler was born in 2012, there was this romance with social media, romance with Facebook, that social media was really for social good. In fact, that was really the overall mission of Rappler, to use social media for the good and for social change. And that's why we started on Facebook. Actually, we did not even have a website then. But lo and behold, 2-3 years later, the very platform that we use to exponentially grow Rappler from a little known website. We were used to be called Grappler or Raffler because they couldn't really get, it's not a very popular brand by then. The social media platform was eventually used against us, not just by leaders who were hurt by our investigative journalism, but also by other critics as well. And so in 2016, Duterte campaigned largely as the first, we would say the first social media president in the Philippines. Because while social media was there before he ran for the presidency, it was his team that really took advantage of it and exploited it to the maximum, and help propel him to victory. And so going back, for example, to the authoritarianism that we're familiar with, I mean, the Philippines is no stranger to authoritarians or to dictators. We've had Ferdinand Marcos for 20 years. But when in the environment where Rappler was born, the authoritarian tendencies of leaders like Duterte saw Facebook, saw the platform as the fuel that could facilitate things for leaders. When back in the day, the likes of Suharto or Marcos would take years to actually make effective government propaganda, to buy out media, to imprison journalists, to jail critics. This one really paved the way for that. You did not have to issue martial law. You don't have to jail every critic that you have. You just have to use technology to spread the lies faster than any other tool that has been invented prior to social media. And so that the kind of work that authoritarians would need for maybe 5 years could be done in a year. And the best proof of that is here we are. The biggest TV network has been shut down. Rappler, which is the youngest kid in town, an 8-year-old website, purely online organization has been issued a closure order, but it's still there. The country's biggest newspaper has been threatened, and all on one single narrative, that the media is biased, that the media is corrupt, that the media is out to destroy democracy. And how has the Filipino public embraced that narrative? The generation that was not familiar with the kind of dictatorship that we went through, this generation, easily believed that. Second, the lies about ABS, about Rappler, about Philippine media exponentially spread, of course, became the truth. And in that echo chamber, what we would call the algorithmicized version of reality is such that the media is the bad guy here. And therefore, the media is the obstacle. I mean, even in the height of the pandemic, for example, that's always been the narrative, that the media has been too critical of government efforts against the coronavirus. The media is the obstacle to genuine information, when we all know that that's not the case.
And I love this idea of, the algorithmicized reality, because it does make sense. When I talk to Lam Toy Vo, a reporter at BuzzFeed, she often describes social media as a funhouse mirror. It is a warped and distorted version of what we see. And if you look at sharing behaviors online, it makes sense. Nobody shares really banal things. Like, I often think about, for one, there were several months where I operated my Instagram where I just posted almost identical cat pictures of the same cats day in and day out, and people still liked them, but for the most part, it was a cat sleeping, right? And but it was banal, right? It was the everyday, and nobody's like, I had a pretty okay day, right? Nobody's going to like and share all of those things. And so the way that social media is designed around outrage and hope, to use some of Manuel Castell's framing, really, drives sharing patterns and sharing behaviors. And so, and I agree with you that over time, when you see these things over and over, you hear the same narrative over and over, it starts to become the truth. It starts to feel like reality. And especially in the midst of the pandemic, where we're all mediated, everything has become digitized, even grocery shopping. It has been really hard for folks to handle that level of information without having good distillers like journalists to say, this is what you should pay attention to. And I get your point about, over time, the arc of social media changing, the desire for what it should be and what it could be, as we have new people starting to use it, or new demographics like politicians. Politicians were not early adopters of the internet. They really had to see its potential through the use of it by social movements and press before they really started to adopt it and then turn it into a tool for their own ends. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you if you could, using one of the case studies, or help us get a little bit deeper into the minutia of what some of the content was that you were looking at. And if you have a case study in mind that might help us understand potential tactics that might be used in the US elections, I'd love to hear more about it. I know that you've extensively studied influencers online and looked at the ways that sort of these B-list influencers were propping up Duarte and other politicians. What lessons can we learn from that? And if you want to tell us something colorful about one of the case studies that you've looked at, I would appreciate it.
Sure. And I think you yourself pointed out some of those resonances in the Democratic primary races, right? The reliance of the Bloomberg campaign on micro-influencers and meme pages. The Philippines was ahead of the game. We saw that in 2016 and 2019, where kind of organic-looking pages and influencer accounts at the micro level. So these are not millions of followers, but perhaps 20,000 followers and below, some of them with real faces, some of them with kind of parody accounts. So these could be like trying to be caricatures of political figures or even of government institutions, or even of media institutions, right? And it's supposed to be for fun. It's supposed to be just humorous. A lot of their content is just supposed to be jokes. But at some point, they would be seeding particular hashtags for politicians. And the aim here is a concept that folks at Data and Society have used is attention hacking, right? Like to get a hashtag trending, that would mean the mainstream media would be more likely to pick it up and therefore shape the political conversation. And I think one of the early examples around attention hacking that was really led by parody accounts, innocent looking parody accounts, was around the burial of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the Heroes Cemetery. So this was something that Duterte had approved, Marcos being buried in the Hero Cemetery. And if you would look at the accounts that first seeded it and are the key nodes in that network, those are micro-influencer parody accounts. And so just with a common hashtag, and it made headlines not just in the Philippines, but even in, it made headlines in the BBC as well. So people were saying that, there seems to be real support for the move to give him a hero's burial, and of course now we can see that there's real insidious, pernicious motivations behind that. So yeah, micro influencer accounts, I see that as something that would be easily transposed to other contexts. Also the close groups and how conspiracy theories, also campaigns, both attack ads, but also positive ads for politicians are seeded in particular groups. So these could be for example, in the last election, Flat Earth Facebook groups. I thought Flat Earthers is just a US thing. It's become also a Philippines thing. And these groups were, cesspools of conspiracy theory, but also seeding campaign ads for particular politicians.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times we forget how important it is for people to get drawn in about one thing, and then those groups start to shapeshift. I remember last year I was talking to a journalist about legacy Facebook groups and how a bunch of old Occupy pages had been turned into anti-vaccine pages. And so someone had gone in, and either if the page had been abandoned, or it had been, the content moderator had decided actively to shift the tone of the groups. And now we're starting to see some of these reopen groups, which are the groups related to spreading more medical misinformation about COVID-19. Some of them are, one in particular, a journalist showed me, was a pet adoption group that had been repurposed to be a reopen group. And so we're starting to see the way in which this technology is designed is giving amplification power over to some of these manipulators. So let's get to talking a little bit more pointedly, Gabby, about resistance, right? What is it in the groups that you were looking at? What kind of tactics, what kind of solidarity was necessary to go after and try to fight some of these policies, or to stop them before they even started to gain traction? Or is it the case that maybe you don't fight that war and you pick another one, in terms of what these groups were actually doing and what we might learn from them related to how do we fight back but don't give up the turf, right? We don't want to give up the terrain because it's so important.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. I think it's going to differ region to region, country to country. When I was studying Malaysia and the anti-fake news law came about, I think what was very important was that civil society fought back, not just by, you know, saying we need civil liberties and free speech is important, because those are often very abstract concepts that people don't get. It's like, all right, yeah, democracy is nice, I guess. But what they were able to do was link it to corruption, like very high level billion-dollar corruption. And corruption is something everyone cares about. And at the time, the ruling coalition, the incumbent, led by Najib Razak, he made, I think, 2 tactical errors. One, corruption in Asia is kind of just, it happens all the time. But his level of corruption was like astronomical. So an activist I talked to said, you know, had he stolen just like a few million, you know, maybe it would be okay, but he stole like hundreds of millions. So people started to notice. And on top of that, the government instated a service. And so not only are you stealing from the people, you were taxing everyone. And because it was a goods and service tax, everyone was paying. You were buying an ice cream cone, you had to pay for it. It wasn't just hitting like, you know, the upper echelons of society. So when you have those 2 things, that I think is fertile ground to fight back. And so a lot of the narratives that the opposition politicians were using, activists were using, were saying, you know, this Anti-Fake News Act is really a way to cover up for corruption. Oh, cat, sorry.
Dobby.
He wants the attention.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we're talking about corruption as a way to uncover these issues.
Yeah, I think finding something that's more tangible. So in the face of declining economic prospects, high unemployment, corruption, I think things are more tangible, and linking that back to why do we need free speech? We can't just talk about it in abstract terms. We really have to talk about why is it important and how does it actually improve the well-being and quality of life. And I think corruption, especially in Asia, is, and I'm sure it is in many parts of the global South, is a huge issue.
Jonathan, did you want to also chime in about some of the effective resistance strategies that you've been seeing as things evolve? I see, you know, fighting disinformation, I see it as a new normal. I see that we are going to have to do this for the long haul, and that we're going to have to be attuned to both the technological environment, but also the political context in which we work. And so I'd love to hear a bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, and I'd love to, for the conversation, to also move into platform regulation. I'm sure I see a few questions in our chat room address that. Before I get into platform regulation, just to add to what Gabby said around some giving people something concrete and tangible to fight for. I think about an example of human rights actors in the Philippines who were very effective in engaging a narrative war, particularly around a proposition to lower the age of criminal responsibility to 9 years old. So that was like one of the proposals from, was it from the lower house? And the human rights group, it was a child rights network that engaged with them. It was rather than just stick to abstract human rights principles, as Gabby would say, to engage populist publics and address their fears and anxiety. So they presented them real evidence and research to say that to jail somebody at such a young age, they would more likely escalate to become bigger criminals and commit like graver acts down the road. So to affirm fears around security, and to present like real facts around that was a way in which they tried to challenge that, and they were successful with their lobbying. Number two is around platform regulation, and I think there's a lot of interest around this. The challenge that I observe in Southeast Asia is that regulation seems to be a bad word. That it comes across to industry allies, to academics, even to journalists. Regulation already for them would assign so much responsibility to the government, right? And the government here is a likely bigger bad actor, not to be trusted. And so to give them any kind of control over decisions around content that will heighten people's fears and anxiety. So for me, like I still advocate for transparency and accountability to make things fairer and more transparent, particularly around issues of advertising, influencer marketing, to at least know who the people are behind the posts, behind particular paid expressions, and have a conversation around that, and to assign precise levels of responsibility and accountability there. So rather than just to assign like particular legislative frameworks, or even to trust Facebook or platforms. And they've been very uneven with regard to how they've engaged journalists, academics, and government and industry across Southeast Asia. There's no one framework that they apply from one country to another.
And I think that's an important point, which is to say that the kinds of rules that these platform companies will apply here in the US may have bleed over effects into other countries, which is to say they don't want to build separate systems for every place. But in particular as well, when authoritarian governments start to make these laws, they do augment the monitoring and the flagging systems around content moderation. And that can be particularly daunting if you get used to running your social media in a particular way, and then there's a whole new rule set. But I'm not getting, we have to wrap up now, but maybe Linda, I want to ask you a bit about what Rappler's been doing in terms of trying to get accountability from some of these social media companies. And then I would also love for us to talk a little bit about how everyone and other journalists can help support Rappler, raise awareness, really rattle, our, I was going to say sabers, but maybe that's too much of a comic booky image. But, really, like, how can we help? We've posted the link, of course, for rappler.com/crowdfunding, and financial help makes a big difference, but also other things that you've, seen in terms of solidarity that has really helped keep the motivation of your team high. So yeah, a word about what you're doing to ensure that you are heard at these social media companies, and then how do we support you?
Well, first of all, we'd like, and we are doing as much as we can to make Facebook and all the other platforms accountable. We are of the belief that journalism and politics is in ICU. We understand, for example, some probably institutional medium-term, long-term approach to this problem, but there's got to be a surgery that's needed here, and the kind of attack that we'd like to approach, the way we'd like to approach is precisely to engage Facebook, to make it accountable for the lies that it allows to be spread on its platform, and to expose those lies, because we are not just an NGO, we are not a human rights organization, we are a journalism institution. And when we see lies, we call them out, and we do not only call them out, we actually expose people who promote those lies. And that doesn't exclude just the platform itself, but those influencers that really help promote those lies in their networks. And so there's what we'd call maybe a love-hate relationship with Facebook and all the platforms, because we're there. I mean, the Philippines, Facebook is oxygen to the Filipinos. They live on Facebook, and therefore we're there. We have no choice but to be there. But we are a critical partner of all these platforms. We'd like to be part of their reform path, and we don't want it to happen next week or next month. We want to do it every single day, every time that we see something wrong with it. And so that's the kind of approach that we're doing towards these platforms. As far as Rappler is concerned, I think would be three things that we'd like other journalists to do in support of press freedom, not only in the Philippines, but in Southeast Asia. I think first of all is more than probably just supporting the legal defense of Rappler and all the Philippine journalists who are under attack, is for journalists around the world to continue to hold the line. Because once we should be able to show collectively to power that we cannot be cowed and we cannot be silenced, not by the threats, not by disinformation. I think as a collective effort, we have to really do that. I know it's easier said than done, especially in more repressive regimes, but that's the line that we draw when you're in the trenches and you're in the battlefield and you know that there's a war going on and you have to fight that. Secondly, I think for the rest of the world to continue telling the story of not just of Rappler, but really of the kind of journalism that is needed at this time in the face of disinformation. Journalism has never been more important and significant. And we'd like fellow journalists to be able to really just fight back and push back. And there's a lot of collaborative work going on, and that's something that we welcome and we'd like to push forward. What the kind of global crisis brought about by disinformation and the road to authoritarianism has taught Rappler is that we're not alone. And the more collaborative work that we do with other journalists in the Philippines, as well as outside, would push forward journalism because it is under threat. And therefore we have to have a collective effort to protect it.
Muted there. I completely agree with you, and I think that this hold the line, is a really important message to send, that we need journalists to continue to expose disinformation, to raise up the truth, especially in the midst of regimes and governments that are trying to protect their reputations, more so than the public. Any closing thoughts from Gabby or Jonathan as we wrap up here? Things that, the little nuggets of knowledge that you'd like to leave with the rest of our participants here? A vote for the future. Just tell me it's gonna be okay, Gabby. That's all I need to hear.
It's gonna be okay, Joan. I think like something.
You are such a liar.
It's gonna be okay. Something I always think about is, that like we talk about this all the time. Disinformation is entirely socio-technical, right? We need to hold the technical platform, like the platforms, accountable, but we also need to look at what are the social drivers. I think, Jonathan, you talked about this earlier, the hidden anxieties that are being addressed. These are real grievances often. And I think we should, as a society, reflexively look at ourselves and see what are those social grievances that are so deeply rooted that need addressing. That's a hard question. That's gonna take decades and generations maybe to address, but gotta start somewhere.
That's true. Jonathan?
And for me, it's also about complicity, and it's not just about good and evil, or just identifying just one singular origin point or person to hold accountable. But yeah, let's look at those 70 lawmakers who had voted not to renew the franchise of ABS-CBN. Let's look at the complicity of industry folks who actually profit from a lot of the lies and disinformation that are professionally produced, and have a more precise language around responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with you that we need to have more responsibility, but also a better way of talking about it. I think that some of the things that have come out of this conversation today is that we can't talk in the abstract. We have to point to examples. We have to point to the real harms, and we have to gain our traction before we can then start talking about our more grand principles of democracy and accountability and fairness and transparency. We have to know why we need them, and especially why we need a kind of free speech that also doesn't silence and oppress others, right? And that's the tension of our socio-technical environment, where the technology facilitates a lot of things that many of us don't always see and understand. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to thank our panelists, Linda, Jonathan, and Gabby. It was just a real pleasure to talk to you this morning. And I look forward to seeing you all on the internet, and I hope you are well. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
Thank you.
Good evening and good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good evening. Thank
Bye,
you.
Linda. Bye, Jonathan.
Bye-bye. Bye, Jonathan. Bye.